Georgios Deligiannakis received his MA and PhD from Oxford and is currently teaching classics at Open University in Cyprus. He most recently published the monograph, A Cultural History of Late Roman Cyprus, through the Cyprus Research Foundation, and is here with me to talk about the last pagans in Cyprus in late antiquity. Yorgos, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you. Well, it was my pleasure.
I wanted to start off with sort of an open question before we dive into late antiquity and those transformative years. By asking the question, what was Cyprus in late antiquity like?
Well, that's an interesting question to start with. Cyprus in late antiquity was actually a success story because Cyprus grows grows up very as a prosperous province of the east of the Roman Empire, and it lies along the big maritime avenues that were connecting the big urban centers of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's Antioch, Alexandria, and the new capital of the empire, Constantinople. So the island benefited a lot from sea trade, the moving of goods, of ideas, of religious figures, of important people, of the bureaucracy. So it's a very prosperous period for Cyprus late antiquity. And to be more specific, we're talking about the period from, let's say, the third century to the seventh century. So in this period, Cyprus moves from the margins, so to say, to more to the mainstream of the empire.
So, in one of your papers, where I borrowed the name for this episode, titled "The Last Pagans of Cyprus," you mentioned that the challenges that historians face in interpreting the transition from paganism to Christianity in late antiquity is vast. So, what are some of those challenges that historians face in sort of piecing together this puzzle?
Okay, writing the history of religious change is a very complicated issue. Above that, our historical sources are very limited, fragmentary, and in many respects not enough, quantitatively and qualitatively, for the modern historian to tackle so complex a matter. Also, we should remember that we read texts that come from a cultural war with modern terms between pagan Christians and Jews. So all texts that are available to us are subject to their own agendas and bias. And in this culture war, the state, the church, local elites, and the people, the mob, were all playing a particular role in its place. And most importantly, it is always the winners, that is the Christians or the Orthodox Christians, who chose what kind of sources we finally would finally survive for us to use. Also, material culture. I mean, excavation and archaeological finds are often ambivalent for us. For example, in the case of destroyed temple or a pagan statue that the archaeologists, find broken in small pieces. It's not easy to know who were the agents of destruction. Were they human? Were they natural forces? It was a result of religious violence, a strong earthquake, a big fire, or it was recycling marble or other stone for a new building, or used for lime or building material. So it's not always easy to say and see behind that a kind of religious violence or iconoclasm. So the modern historian needs to face all these challenges, to put the right questions to its data, to read behind the lines, to consider what kind of information was likely or unlikely to survive, to make room for one-sided accounts, even dissimulation, crypto-Christians, crypto-pagans, social coercion, and many, many more.
When it comes to text evidence, then you're not. I mean, the textual evidence that exists at the time, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's one-sided, and so for that you have to rely on other pieces of evidence to kind of piece together a more nuanced picture of the period, such as epigraphy, monuments, that sort of stuff. Am I correct in making that conclusion?
Right, right. The bulk of our evidence is Christian text of the right version, I mean, the Orthodox version. So the pagan side is mostly lost to us, for us, in most cases. So we have almost always the one side of the story. So the historian should fill in these gaps and demonstrate a concern for all this material, no matter how small. Is it a broken piece of text in an inscription? Is it a piece of sculpture? To use its imagination, to empathize with different kinds of people who lived in the past, to know very well the historical context of the period. So, by comparison, to fill in these blanks, and to make the best use of all available evidence, no matter how fragmentary and problematic or meager is.
Right. So, what's the earliest textual evidence that we have for Christianity in Cyprus? Would it be from the Acts of the Apostles when Saint Paul visited the island and most famously converted the proconsul?
Exactly, that's right. This text, the Acts, was written around 90 AD, and in one of the chapters, as you said, we read about the evangelization of the island by Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark in 45. These three first spoke in the Jewish synagogues of the island because they almost always did so. But on Cyprus, we should mention that at that period there was a large and flourishing Jewish community, which remained so until about 117, when a bloody revolt occurred against the local Greek and Roman population. So the Roman troops came to the island and annihilated the Jewish community of Salamis and the rest of the island. So the Acts, the main episode related to Cyprus is the conversion of the governor of the island, Sergius Paulus. Barnabas also was a Cypriot Jew, so he knew the area. And but in the Acts, we find some more passing references about Christian missionaries from Jerusalem visiting Cyprus, and Cypriot Christians who had fled to Antioch. So we get a picture of early Christianity already in the late first century AD on the island.
But while talking about sources, I mean, some of the traditional sources for the period, they come from hagiographical works. And if you don't mind kind of explaining what those are. And for example, we have the Vita of Epiphanius, who is a significant Cypriot saint. And this, I suppose, kind of provides other textual insight into the period, albeit it is heavily biased because, they're hagiographical. So, for example, Epiphanius, like what does his Vita tell us? And then what are some of the problems with relying on these types of sources?
The problem for us is that after the Acts, there is a long gap in references to Cypriot Christianity until the early fourth century. In the third century, we have the well-known Christian persecutions that took place empire-wide, and we guess also on Cyprus. However, in the early Christian literature, there are no secure references to Cypriot martyrs and early bishops, like in ecclesiastical chronicles or in historical sources. So Cypriot Christianity resurfaces in our sources, but only as passing references in the early fourth century. Now, hagiography, as you said, is an idealized biography of a saint or a collection of his or her miracles, usually written long after the events it describes, with a view to proselytize, to promote the cult of its hero, or to advance his authority as an ecclesiastical leader. Hagiographical texts, the earliest hagiography referring to Cyprus goes back to the late 5th century. The Vita of Epiphanius is dated to the late 5th century or 6th century. So these texts usually produce a one-sided historical picture in hindsight most of the times, especially regarding the process of Christianization, and they almost always present it as a swift triumph of Christianity. So gleaning a historical kernel from this chaff of such tales can be very challenging. The Vita of Epiphanius, written in Greek, recounts the life and miracles of the Bishop of Salamis that occurred a century or so earlier. It was probably written by two of his disciples, Ioannis and Polybios, in Salamis. And the text is meant to propagate his memory and legacy and to promote his cult in Salamis. The historical Epiphanius came to Cyprus in 376 when he became Bishop of Salamis until his death for almost 4 decades. It was a very important figure for Cyprus, and we learn about him also from his own writings. The most famous piece of work is Panarion, a treatise on heresies, and from information provided by other contemporary or near contemporary ecclesiastical writers. So the task of the historian is to combine all this information and writes a narrative the best he can.
So, just so that I make sure that I'm clear on this, as far as text evidence goes, we have the Acts of the Apostles, and then we have a period of silence in the sources, and
Right.
then in Cyprus, we eventually have these vitas that are written about the first bishops, and that serves as our first.
Long after their life, right?
Yeah, long after their lives. Okay. So yeah, that sounds definitely problematic for a historian to sort of piece together what the period would look like. I guess that's made even more difficult because, as you mentioned at the start of this interview, we have temples that collapse, and and we don't know really, did they collapse from earthquakes or were they, I don't know, potentially torn down? You actually wrote at one point that it's been suggested that the earthquakes were, and I quote, a catalyst for the decline of the infrastructure for the suppression of local paganism. What are you trying to say with that? Or what is the common belief around the periods that led to the decline of traditional worship, specifically with temples? Was that just, hey, these temples are torn down and it's perfect for Christianity? Or was it more of a gradual and piecemeal conversion? Because we know that there are some late Roman historians, who both mention the temples of Aphrodite and Zeus in Cyprus in the 4th century, which suggests that there's still active worship in that period.
Yeah, what makes our task more difficult is that at the time that we have these earthquakes on Cyprus, which is the 330s and the 360s, it is exactly the period that irrespective of the growth of Christianity, spending on pagan temples and festivals, even for among the pagan communities, was declining. So already in the third century, because of a huge crisis for the empire, because of economic collapse and the invasion along the borders of the empire, pagan sanctuaries fall out of imperial favor. Rich people spend less money on their infrastructure and upkeeping. At the same time, because of the economic crisis, these public buildings suffered expropriation of their treasures and gradual abandonment. And later, in the fourth century, we have an official ban, repeated several times on their use and occupation. So we can guess that the fourth century earthquakes in Cyprus marked here, as elsewhere, the final abandonment of the few sites that possibly still remained functional in this period, even though hard evidence often evade us. In any case, after the fourth century, we hear nothing about these sites, and the archaeological record usually suggests destruction and abandonment of these sites. We don't find coins or ceramics dated later to the fourth century.
What sort of measures were used to suppress worship in Cyprus? Did they, for example, confiscate temple assets? Do we have evidence of temple conversions on the archaeological record?
Well, we have a particular section of the Theodosian Code. It's a compilation of imperial legislation. There's a special section titled "On Pagan Sacrifices and Temples," and there all the anti-pagan laws a selection of anti-pagan laws are put together from the time of Constantine until the time of Theodosius II, the first in the 430s. It is a very important source for us, beside the archaeological evidence. And one could describe these laws as a tool of coercive social engineering that sought to turn the pagan population into social outcasts. There we read about these laws become progressively harsher and always include a wider spectrum of penalized activities, like bans on blood sacrifices, statue worship, pagan festivals, the order of the closing of temples, confiscation of temple assets, destruction of cult statues or buildings or temples, and harsh penalties on worshippers and violators. On the other hand, the enforcement of these laws was a very piecemeal and patchy process. For example, there is a story in the Vita of Saint Epiphanius in which the bishop appropriates the treasure of the abandoned temple of Zeus in Salamis. And this temple was one of the temples that survived longer into the fourth century. And we know that because some historians, and among them the Emperor Julian, refers to it. So this sounds very familiar compared to other accounts of bishops, historical accounts, bishops taking over treasures and the lands of these used temples, usually with the approval of the imperial authorities. So for Cyprus, no, we don't have temple conversions, but temple conversions were anyway exceptional events no matter how useful they were as part of the Christian propaganda. But famous examples are the Athenian Parthenon, which was turned into a church
Right.
of Saint Mary in the late fifth, sixth century, the Serapeion in Alexandria, the Pantheon in Rome. But for Cyprus, no.
Do the lack of texts around religiously motivated aggression in Cyprus, does that suggest a peaceful transition? I mean, how would this period compare to, say, you mentioned Alexandria, and there's the infamous story of what the early Christians did to Hypatia. So, do we have any evidence of conflict between pagan and Christian groups, or rather, text evidence about conflict?
Not much, not much. Some hagiographical texts occasionally report conflict and iconoclastic violence in Cypriot cities, while others do not. But all these texts, as we said, are dated several centuries after the events they describe. And so they usually repeat literary topoi of this particular genre about Christian holy men fighting pagan demons and idols. So we are not sure if they report actual events, and we don't know the pagan side of the story. For example, the Vita of Epiphanius describes no outburst of violence, and yet sets its hero in a society where the members of the local nobility were still pagan in the second half of the fourth century, still pagan until the end of his life, by which time he had converted them all.
I vaguely recall there is an apocryphal text, I believe, of bishops or saints going to Amathus and condemning the rituals. There was a libation, I believe, that was done on the hilltop for Aphrodite, and they condemned the libation, and then they, I believe, removed the dust from their sandals. I think that was the expression. Do you know what it is that I'm referring to?
There are more than one hagiographical text that mention Amathus as a place of, how to say, die-hard pagan cults and pagans. The episode you mentioned, I think, comes from an apocryphal text, Acta Barnabe, which is the feats of Barnaba, and it's dated to the mid or late fifth century. It gives many local details, so we assume that it was written by a local Cypriot, and talks about the travels of Barnabas, Paul, and John that we find in the Acts. So in the first century Cyprus. So it's a text written, around four centuries after the actual events that it describes. Yeah, it's a question to what extent we can rely on these accounts. But anyway, the information we have for Cyprus is very meager compared to places like Alexandria or Antioch or Gaza, where such accounts of religious violence are known.
Speaking of Epiphanius and some of his roles that you sort of alluded to, we read that Cyprus had sent between two and three bishops to the Council of Nicaea in the might be fourth century. I don't remember exactly the date, but it raises the question: is what were their bishopric responsibilities? What were their roles? I mean, did they have to focus on the conversion of elites? Did they work among the local populace? Were they in charge of philanthropy and church building? What were their roles in this period?
Right. Their role is not much different from their role nowadays. They were targeting elites as well as the populace. But the conversion of the elites, and one can see that in the Vita of Epiphanius, brought more prestige to the church and more money through donations afterwards, and many more converts among the clients and family members of these rich families. So, besides ceremonies and catechesis, the bishop was representing his community in ecclesiastical councils. He had administrative duties of all kinds, cooperation with other officials for public projects, money raising for alms and church building. The first attested bishops of Cyprus who were at the Council of Nicaea in 325 was Spiridon of Trimithus, the bishop of Paphos, and Gelasius of Salamis. And this information by itself tells us that these cities had already well organized Christian communities.
Would it also suggest that Cyprus was fully Christianized by this time, or that wouldn't make any sense based on what the sources from Ammianus tells us, the Roman historian who talks about the Temple of Zeus and Temple of Aphrodite? I think I might have just answered the question myself. Alternatively, maybe I can say, when can we confidently say Christianity was dominant and paganism had all but disappeared?
We can only guess, right? But we cannot say that the majority of the population was converted before the fifth century, and for almost total Christianization of the island, we should say as late as the sixth century. So it was a long process. All this.
What would persuade a pagan in Cyprus to convert? Like, what did Christianity have to offer those living in Cyprus? Why was it such a persuasive religion? And I know that's a very difficult question to answer, but what made it so appealing?
There have been given very different answers to this question. I would start with the simplest one, which was the support of the emperor for a long time. So we have a succession of Christian emperors from Constantine, with the exception of Julian, and onwards. So we see the church and the emperor side by side to support the evangelization of the population. At the same time, the strong ethical concept of Christianity gave, and the promises for the afterlife gave hope to many people. Some historians have suggested that it was a combination of elements coming from the Jewish religion and the pagan cults, especially the pagan mysteries, but also this idea of supreme God, the promises for the afterlife. This combination, this cocktail of different elements, plus the support of the imperial power, was the decisive factor for that. Yeah, and after a while, as I said, there's also a kind of pressure for the remaining pagans to convert.
We talked about the challenges of textual evidence to kind of paint a picture on late antiquity Cyprus. What about the concrete evidence? What sort of challenges do we face? I mean, I'll give you an example. Do we know when church structures were first built across the island, and if if not, why? Like, what are some of the challenges of identifying early churches other than those basilicas that were built later on? How come we're not able to sort of say, hey, there's, this was a church in the second century, for example?
Apart from churches or congregation buildings, one should mention a few Christian inscriptions, mostly funerary inscriptions, funerary epitaphs, which belong to Christians. This is a useful piece of information for us. As far as for church structures, the earliest attested, identified Christian examples of Christian architecture are located in the cities of Soloi and Tamassos, and they go back to the early 4th century. But the absence of more such examples or modest early Christian cult buildings in other cities and towns in this period, or even before the 3rd or 2nd century AD, could simply indicate that Christian communities, as you implied, continue to gather in places of no fixed architectural articulation, so that we can recognize it today. So these early congregation buildings, we know that through the sources, these communities used to gather in the city, in the houses of the richest members of the community. So we're talking about house churches. So small modifications so that the ritual is possible, but no independent or public building.
There's some mosaics that were surprisingly built during this period of transition that still celebrated pagan motifs, symbols. I think there's the House of Theseus, the House of Aeon in Paphos. I might be mistaken about that, but it suggests a revitalization of pagan expression in this time, which sort of went hand in hand with the Christianization of the island. So what would this suggest? Why do we still have this proliferation of quote unquote paganism at the same time as Christianity is spreading across the island?
Right. Yeah, you are referring to one of the highlights of Cypriot cultural heritage. These fabulous mosaics from which decorated grand palaces or very wealthy mansions in Paphos and elsewhere, where the local plutocracy lived. So, for many scholars, the mythological panels of these houses, especially the so-called House of Aeon, they believe that they function. These panels function as a religious manifesto of the last pagans, working as a counterbalance to Christianity. They assume that a new version of the god Dionysus, a universal savior, is there depicted, being allegedly an alternative to Christianity and Jesus Christ. I disagree with these views. I rather believe that these mythological themes, which were very popular in the previous centuries and still in the 4th century, simply evoke traditional elite values of good living, wealth, classical learning, and some perhaps a local version of popular myths. These colorful mosaics, along with wall paintings, sculpture, and other furnishings, most of which are lost for us. Through them, the owner of these rich houses sought to present himself to the viewers and the visitors, to boast of his wealth and good taste, and invite his guests to enjoy an official ceremony or a banquet with no any special religious significance. The owners might have been pagans, of course, but not necessarily, because learned Christians continued to appreciate this imagery, and they used it when they wanted to be part of these elite groups and be part of this culture. So even for a Christian, this imagery was not something necessarily associated with paganism, pagan cult, pagan demons, etc. Was a sign of good taste and high culture.
But that's not to suggest that there weren't moments of concealment of pagan expressions. So, for example, I think in Salamis, there's a bath complex where wall decorations were actually covered with plaster, which surprised me. I did not expect to come across that. On the other side of the coin, so to speak, how common was the defacement of pagan art in Cyprus around this period?
We don't have many examples of religious iconoclasm in Cyprus. As for the bath complex of Salamis that you mentioned, the excavator of this site, Vassos Karagiorgis, had suggested that part of the mythological decoration there on the arches of this bath was walled up with the aim of concealing from view some mythological scenes. In the same complex, in the same building, a good number of mythological statues were found, and which had their genitals carefully mutilated, which means that they remained on display later and after a kind of sanitizing job by Christians, perhaps in the 5th century.
Yeah.
And one can see these sanitated naked statues at the Archaeological Museum in Nicosia.
Right. I think most famously, I think it's the statue of Apollo. I think he's holding a lyre.
Exactly.
Now, it's interesting that in this early period of Christianity, specifically for Cyprus, we spoke a lot about Aios Epiphanios, and I realized in preparing for this episode that there are, and I had no idea. I never put two and two together. There are more bishops that are canonized in Cyprus than the traditional martyrs and monks that we have in early Christianity. First off, why is there that discrepancy with the rest of Christendom? And then the other question is, what events or miracles were associated with these bishops that merited their canonization?
There isn't an easy answer to this question. One possible answer could be that Christianity in Cyprus, the spread of Christianity in Cyprus, was mainly an urban phenomenon. So it started from the cities and spread into the countryside. So the most important figures of the Christian faith on the island were the bishops. Although monasteries did exist in the countryside already in these early periods, meaning the 4th century. At some point, and this is interesting in this case, we notice a kind of competition among the cities in the form of the cult of these bishop saints, and if possible, bishops from the apostolic times, which the historical the historical science does not accept, as for example Barnabas or Eusebius or Lazarus of Larnaca. So we have this kind of competition. Each city, its celebrated bishop saint, and along with the production of hagiographical lives, as we said and talked about before, along with the building of elaborate big churches and martyria churches across the island. So, as far as how these important figures were canonized, well, we read in the Vitae stories about miraculous healings, fighting pagan demons, administrative justice, and almost always converting many pagans.
I was wondering if you could relate, how did Cyprus, I mean, in early Christianity, Cyprus, I believe, was under the Church of Antioch, and later it received its autocephalic status sometime in the 5th century. Could you relate that story to us? How does that actually go about happening for Cyprus?
Right. So, according to the ecclesiastical system of the 4th century, let's say, the bishops of major sees assumed jurisdiction over the metropolitan districts of the empire in the same way as in the secular administration, the prefectures of the empire. So, in the case of Cyprus, its metropolitan bishop should have been subject, as you said, to the patriarchate of Antioch, a very important city, both for the empire, a mega city, but also for the history of Christianity in this area. But the Cypriots, oddly enough, wanted they wanted to be independent, and their argument was that no one ever was involved in appointing the metropolitans, all the other bishops of Cyprus, since the time of the Holy Apostles, right? Since the time of Barnabas. Another argument for the Cypriot representatives at the councils, at the church councils, where these discussions were made, was that Cyprus was the motherland and the burial place of no less than the Apostle Barnabas. So the Church of Cyprus has an apostolic claim. So there was a dispute and conflict that was going on for a long time, and ended towards the end of the 5th century, around 488, when the grave of Saint Barnabas was miraculously discovered. So that was the decisive event that ended the dispute in favor of the Cypriots, and with the approval of the Emperor Leo.
In one of your papers, I believe you talk about something that I've never heard before, and I don't know of their presence in Cyprus. I think they're called the Hypsisterians, and they were in Cyprus. I just wanted, for the record, to sort of find out who these people were, and what evidence do we have of them, and what sort of practices they were engaged in.
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon of, let's say, late paganism. So the Hypsisterians was a religious group which worshipped the highest god, Theos Hypsistos. This is what we find in the epigraphical evidence. But of course, for the church, the Hypsistarians were heretics and were labeled a public enemy, and like all the other heresies, were at some point persecuted. So we have a Christian source about this group. It's the Church Father Gregory of Nazianzus, whose own father was one of them. He was a Hypsistarian, and he reports that they rejected idols and sacrifice, but they raised small altars and dedicated lamps to their god. So in their cult practice, they were minimalists. At the same time, they respected the Jewish Sabbath and other dietary regulations of the Jews, but they were not circumcised. So it was a quasi monotheist or henotheist worshippers with ideas, a mixture of pagan, Greek, and Jewish elements. So we find them in different places across the empire. In Cyprus, we have around 40 inscriptions from small altars and plaques, dedications to Theos Hypsistos. They come mostly from the Limassol district. 40 inscriptions out of around 300 empire-wide. And two or three of them one can see at the Museum of Limassol, at the Roman collection. And this small community seems to survive until the 4th century, by the end of which it disappears or dies out or persecuted, or its members were converted. We don't really know what happens with them.
What sort of inscriptions would tell us that, hey, this is the Hypsisterians who are practicing here?
They're actually individuals who dedicate an altar or a plaque implying a kind of healing, of miraculous healing, to Theos Hypsistos, the highest god. These are very short dedicatory texts.
The transitional periods of any sort of any part of the world, any civilization that goes through transformative events, I'm always fascinated by, and I'm even more fascinated by things that we've somehow retained into our present, so-called syncretism. I find it incredibly fascinating, and you actually wrote a paper in Greek, and I do speak Greek, but to read academic Greek, it's a little bit challenging. But I think I successfully made it through your paper on Cataclysmos, which is one of those festivals that we retain to this day, especially in Cyprus. And I was really fascinated to learn about there are Roman roots to this festival that we still have today, much like there's Roman roots to a lot of the Christian celebrations that we have in the 21st century, Christmas, for example. Can you tell me about the cataclysm and the earliest references and what your work has suggested about its roots?
The first reference, the earliest reference, modern reference, is from English traveler Pocock in the 18th century. And in the next century, 19th century, around the middle of 19th century, we have the German archaeologist Onefals Richter, who visited and excavated in Cyprus. They say that they see in this festival the ancient celebrations honoring Venus or Adonis. In my view, the ancient roots of this 3-day festival, which is very particular to Cyprus, go back to two other late antique festivals. First of all, to say what Cataclysmos
Yeah,
is.
you just,
3-day festival. It includes Soul Saturday, dedicated to the dead, Pentecost Sunday, which is 50 days after Easter Sunday, and Monday of Cataclysmos, right? So most people believe that this water-based festival on Monday, especially Sunday and Monday, is related to the pagan festivals of Venus and Adonis. So I suggest that instead that Cataclysmos may have its roots in the festival of Rosalia, which was also dedicated to the dead's memory, and the spring festival of Mayumas is a Roman, Greek, Syrian festival, which was particularly associated with the sea or with water and water sports, right? So we have here some striking similarities between these pagan festivals and the Pentecost celebrations. Both festivals were celebrated around the same time of the year, unlike the case of Venus and Adonis, and they also survived as folklore events into the Byzantine times, cut off from their paganized roots, were just an opportunity for good time celebration without any connection to pagan demons or something like that. So here, what we have the universal Christian calendar, which is the celebration of Pentecost, which in the case of Cyprus appropriates elements of local folklore celebration. So we have a mix, like in the case of the Hypsistarians, some pagan stuff with some Christian stuff, something like that.
well, I wanted to learn a little bit more about some of these festivals. You mentioned one in particular, which is Mayumas, which is a Roman festival that I've never heard of before.
Right.
Uh, I think that was the one that you said is probably the most convincing, the most compelling as being a work that
Yeah,
is rooted
because
in.
because it took place in early summer, in May or early June in antiquity, and we read that on this day people were throwing other people to into the sea. They were shower each other and these things like that they survive, and we experience nowadays during these days.
Yeah, it's like, again, I find it really interesting because one of the ways that, especially in early Christianity, one of the ways that you convert pagan populations is you co-opt their festivities, right? And you
Right.
Christianize them, you baptize them, and we're talking about the last pagans in Cyprus, and so I was really drawn to that paper that you wrote on Cataclysmos because I'm convinced that there are many remnants of the past in our modern expressions of cultural identity. Have you come across any other types of religious, syncretism, so to speak, in modern Cypriot culture?
Well, there are many customs associated with very crucial moments of life, like the birth, the marriage, the death, and during these very important moments of human life, we find many survivals of pagan rituals and customs surviving within a Christian framework. As far as syncretism in late antiquity, I would like to refer to another example, which is the expression "is theos." one God, one God. This formulaic phrase, it was an acclamation, or it was a belief statement, or an apotropaic formula, was used in the same period by all major religious groups in late antiquity and on Cyprus. That is, Jews, Christians, and pagans. And although all these groups used this expression, they didn't understand it the same way. So we have 5 examples from Cyprus with this istheos phrase in inscriptions, mostly from a Christian context, and one example from a pagan context. So this implies, of course, a certain degree of syncretism or osmosis between these different religious traditions, and also a kind of competition. Yet, while in a pagan context, this phrase evoked the superiority of particular god, like the god Helios or the god Zeus or Venus, it is as saying there is no other god like this god, which does not rule out the existence and the high status of other gods.
Mm-hmm.
For Christians, it's denoted a singular god. We have here monotheism, while for the pagans and the Jews was not understood the same way. So, if I can go on a little bit on this, there is an inscription probably from a cultic building from modern day Athienu in Messauria Plain, which reads, "The one God, the greatest, most glorious name, help us all, we pray," which is a kind of prayer. Then there is, with smaller letters, the phrase God Helios, which excludes any Christian context or relation here, and at the same time it brings us to a pagan context. Similar prayers were found in objects from a Christian background here in Cyprus and in Syria and Palestine and many other places around across the empire, simply as a kind of a cry during a ceremony, or a graffito on a piece of stone. So we in late antiquity, because we have this overlap, because we have this transition from one religious system to another, we have many examples of this osmosis, of competition, of competitive groups competing for a bigger audience. It's like an agora, a marketplace
Yeah.
of different religion.
Yorgo, this is really interesting, this conversation. I really do appreciate your time today, because this is a period that admittedly I know very little about. And just to have you come here and explain how and why and what historians are working on, and how they piece together this really important period in Cyprus's history, I can't express my gratitude enough. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Andreas.
Take care. Have a great night.
Bye.